Contrary to some other speakers, I will not talk in my mother tongue, because then no one would be able to follow. I hope English will be fine, and I hope some of the workshop discussions will also be in English so that we will be able to follow. Much of what I will share with you today is based on a report that we published already last year, which is called Mental Health and Work in Denmark. We published the same kind of report last week in the Netherlands. Some of these guys have been there at this occasion. But before I do that, I'd like to take a minute to just tell you a little bit about what we have been doing at the OECD in the past 15 years while I was at this organization. We published a report called Transforming Disability into Ability in the year 2002. And the title might give you the impression that what we said back then might still be valid. And I think that's really what I would like to emphasize. I think that was the first report where we very clearly wrote down that actually disability systems in virtually all OECD countries are really a disaster. And a disaster that has to be fixed. And in some way, I'm very happy that this title is still being used now at this conference, because it does show that this report remains relevant. And in a subsequent to this first report, we started a whole series of reports on looking at sickness, disability, and work issues in a number of OECD countries in more detail to understand what is really going wrong and what needs to be done to fix the situation. And as we have heard today already, fixing it really means that we have to move away from this provision of passive benefits, which just sheds people away from the labor market, to actually providing an active employment-oriented labor market program that helps people with health problems to stay in work or return to work. In this series of sickness, disability, and work reviews, we also reviewed Denmark, and then a report back in 2008. I just checked it yesterday what our recommendations were, and I concluded that about 2/3 of the recommendations that we had back then were actually put in place to some degree in the Danish system. Not yet with major success, but we'll come back to that during the presentation. In the latter few years, actually, we shifted our focus, because in working on disability, we realized, well, we're tackling a couple of issues, but we're leaving out big issues. And the real big issue in most social security systems these days is actually mental ill health. And that actually meant to broaden the issue. You might first believe we narrowed the issue by moving to a subgroup of disability, but it's actually the opposite. Mental ill health is a much, much broader issue than disability, not the least because of the extremely high prevalence of mental illness. With 1 in 5 of us being affected by mental ill health at any moment in time, and up to half of us at some point in our lifetime, this is actually a major social and labor market policy issue. And moving into this territory actually also meant to move into analysis of all kinds of policies that go far beyond benefit systems, including education policies, youth policies, health policies, workplace policies. That was what we have done in the past few years. And first we published a report which was called Sick on the Job, which really laid down the basis for this work. We collected all the evidence that we could find for 10 OECD countries to build the story, explain what the challenges really are, and then did this series of country reports where we looked into what countries really do to address the challenges, or actually what they should do to address the challenges. Let me start by looking at the chart, which, no, this is not correct, which nicely shows what the disability problem really is by and large. This is a chart showing the proportion of the population receiving a disability benefit in 3 points in time, 1980, 2000, and 2012. And what you see is that today, which is the black dots, about 6 to 8% of the population in most OECD countries receive a disability benefit, which is a very high number. And this rate has increased very rapidly between the 1980s and 2000, and continued to increase in most countries in the last 12 years. You see a few outliers which have managed to get the problem under control, like the Netherlands, or let's say where the problem has become a lesser problem than it used to be. Where is Denmark in this comparison? Well, you can see that, maybe most interesting, already in 1980 it was a big problem. I don't know to what extent back in that time this was also seen and discussed as a problem. The truth is not much has changed in Denmark in this 30 5 years. In particular, also not so much in the past few years, despite an enormous series of reforms. Because like the Netherlands, Denmark is one of the few countries where we see a lot of change, which is actually making it a very interesting case for someone like me analyzing and comparing systems. Systems where nothing happens is pretty boring to look at. Denmark is a case where we can learn a lot. So far, contrary to the Netherlands, we mostly learn how you can do a lot without achieving anything. Now, the question for Denmark, so why is the situation as it is in Denmark? I think it's not because it is a bad system. In fact, it has a lot of strengths and strong points in the system. The issue really is how can we make sure that these strong elements deliver? What is behind the fact that apparently the good intentions are not really been put in place and elements that are so promising are not really implemented? Among the good elements, obviously, is that you have a municipal job center, which is really a one-stop shop for everyone who is out of the labor market, be it unemployed, sick, long-term unemployed on social assistance benefits. The job centers deal with everyone. You also have pretty strong financial incentives to municipalities to do the right thing. They have strong incentives to actually integrate and reintegrate people and not let them sit on benefits and just watch them sitting there. You also have a really interesting flex job system, which in principle is exactly what we think, what we need. People are paid for what they deliver by the employer, and in addition, they get subsidies from the state to compensate for their reduced capacity. You also have a very strong emphasis in your systems on assessing ability and not disability, which a lot of other countries still do. And lately, the most interesting innovation is what we call the rehab model for people who are no longer entitled to apply for disability benefit. And this new model, as much as we understand it, does include all the elements of what a system should have. Whether it will deliver, we will yet have to see. So in a way, I think all these elements are extremely strong, but unfortunately, they have not yet really delivered what they could. And actually, talking about mental health, as I said, it's a much broader issue. You also have very strong features in some other parts of the system, in the workplace policies, and youth policies, and health policies. Quite a few things where you really are ahead of many other OECD countries. Now, let me look at a few of the main challenges in this area, and I will mostly focus on employment policies and benefit policies because this is the topic of this one-day conference, and I will not look into the many other fields we have looked at in this report. I think this chart really nicely shows how the reform efforts in the past have not really had any success. What we know is that the number of people relying on health-related benefits in Denmark has actually, rather than fall, has increased in the period after the reforms have started, basically in 2003. As you can see, this chart only goes until 2011. So with the stronger focus on the flex job system, we have seen increases, pretty large increases in the number of people receiving a flex job, also increases in the number of people receiving a waiting allowance, but that has not had any impact on the number of people on disability benefit, which basically stayed flat. Which suggests that actually it was the wrong group of people who got these flex job subsidies. What is actually also interesting is here the comparison with the unemployment numbers. So in the year 2008, just before the crisis, when unemployment was the lowest in Denmark, the number of people on disability benefit was about 4 times as high as the number of people on unemployment. Question, what has happened after 2011, of course, is the critical one. Before I look into this, in getting reforms right, I think first we really need to understand why they have not delivered. And I think there's not enough knowledge available really why this is the case. What we argue is that to a large extent it has to do with the fact that mental health has been ignored in all these policies. And that if we do not achieve a situation where all of these policies actually have a strong focus on mental health and manage to be successful for this group, then we will actually not be successful with any of these reforms. Talking about some of the recommendations we have in the report around these areas, I think the key for the flex job system will be to eventually come to a situation where actually those people we have in mind benefit from that system. What has happened in the past very clearly is because it was such a generous system, it did draw people who had a regular job into subsidized employment, which is exactly what we do not want. We would have liked to draw people who are out of employment into subsidized employment. This hasn't really happened. The latest changes of the flex job system really suggest maybe we are now moving towards getting it right. Numbers on flex jobs have continued to increase after 2011. I don't have the information to tell you whether this is now the right group of people or whether it's a continuation of the previous failure. On disability, the key will be to make sure that the new rehab model or resource process that this is called will deliver. What is really interesting to see, the new number of disability benefit claims has suddenly dropped substantially in 2013 and 14. That is promising. It seems that like for the first time, maybe something is happening. The number of new disability benefit claims has fallen by 50%, something I usually only know from the Netherlands. Question is this a sustainable decline? A lot of those people, simply because of the change in the law, are no longer entitled to move on to disability benefit, but they're now in the resource process, which is kind of a new type of benefit. And whether they will just sit there, whether they will actually really make it into employment through this particular new process, that remains to be seen. So I'm really very curious to see in maybe 2-3 years' time, we could get a feeling of whether the latest reforms are actually, for the first time, turning the wheel into the right direction. The other issue, and to broaden the discussion, as I said, there's so much more behind mental health and work links. The key challenge for the job center actually is that there is mental illness everywhere. It's not about disability benefits, it's actually about all kinds of clients they have. In all their clients, between 1/3 and 2/3 suffer from mental ill health. And in particular so among those who have been out of the labor market for longer, like those on social assistance. Is that a Danish phenomenon? Is this specific to Denmark? No, not at all. We find that in all OECD countries. And I think it's one of the major lessons of our review and one of the major stories that we're telling. You are having a huge health issue in your benefit systems which you are ignoring. That is the message that we are giving to virtually all countries. And countries are very slow in picking this up. They have poor systems to identify that this problem is a problem, and they have very limited, if any, tools in place to address it. But again, with the features the Danish system has, it is probably a better place than others to do better. And what is the situation today? Well, the job centers work pretty much with this match group approach, where different clients, depending on their disadvantage, can get more or less service. The other element is that the job centers work pretty much with mainstream services. So the idea being that we have not specialized services for specialized groups, but we have general services, and we want to make sure that everyone can access these services. That seems a good approach in principle, except that it ignores if we have a situation where actually those we would want to access the services do not. Because, for instance, they have additional barriers which we are not addressing. So I think what is really lacking in the job centers is the competence and ability to identify mental health problems, and in particular not only the mental health problems, but the implications they have as a labor market barrier. And these things are not addressed. On the contrary, since the job centers work with this target group approach, where particular target groups get a particular attention, it would make a lot of sense to have people with mental illness as a target group and to measure actually outcomes for this particular group. And in this context, it will be particularly important to put a strong focus on two groups. One is the unemployed who are moving on to sickness benefit. This is obviously a very clear signal there is issues that we could and have to address. And we cannot just say, well, get well first, and then we'll see what your employment problems are. And the second group is the social assistance clients, where the prevalence of mental ill health is particularly high, and who are at a high risk of slowly switching over to a long-term disability benefit. And in terms of policy, obviously what it needs is more resources in terms of lower caseloads for caseworkers who work with clients with mental illness, and in particular also mental health knowledge and competence in the job center itself. I'll come back to that a little later in the conclusion. Another challenge of the challenge is talking of the disability benefit system in itself, what is the challenge there? As we heard from the Netherlands, and we know it from all OECD countries, also there, the real problem in the past few years is actually new claimants with mental ill health. All over the OECD, that is the group that is increasing fast, while other problems are disappearing. Happy to discuss in more detail afterwards why this is happening, what could possibly explain that. But the issue is, I think, that the systems are really not made for that group. And the issue is also that this group is actually different from the rest of the claimants. And the strongest difference is visible here. People who claim with a mental disorder are far away from the labor market, further away than all the other groups. They usually have very poor labor market records, broken labor market careers. And obviously, what this suggests essentially for that group is, well, the disability system is coming far too late. We should have addressed this much, much earlier, which comes back to the previous discussion of addressing mental ill health among the other groups. So once they apply for disability benefit, once they are in the disability benefit system, this is obviously just showing us we're coming too late. Also here, if you would do a chart like that for other countries, it would probably be very similar. So it isn't a Danish speciality. The only difference in this area, I think, here Denmark is really not well placed to tackle the issue because the features of the system rather are work to the contrary. So like in terms of what the challenges are and what should be done, I think, as I said, Denmark has a very strong focus in its assessment systems on looking at the remaining capacity of people rather than their incapacity and disability. And when this resource profile was introduced in 2003, I think we at the OECD really believed, well, that is going to be best practice that we should export to other countries, except that it turned out it didn't even work in Denmark, unfortunately. And I think in particular it did not work for people with mental health issues because probably the system is not doing well in identifying the strengths and capacities of people. So again, goes back to the fact that the whole disability systems, when they were introduced with a completely different target group in mind. So we really need to get this right. And I think there's obviously changes already ongoing in terms of changing the resource profile that is used to assess capacity. I'm not fully familiar what has happened in the last 2 years in this regard. It will also be important that this new rehabilitation model, and particularly if it turns out to work for people under age 40, that we extend that to the entire labor force. There's absolutely no reason why we should use a completely different approach for people under age 40 than for the others. Particularly being over age 40, I really think this is a very stupid idea. Maybe you could argue it with resource constraints that you initially start with those under age 40, but particularly if it delivers, you should gradually extend it to everyone. Also, one other thing is that Denmark is different from other countries, actually not ever even thinking to reassess entitlements. Once people are on disability benefit, they will be there for life. And I think one issue that Denmark also has to look into a little more in detail is the implication of the benefit levels and disability benefit levels. It is very difficult for people with poor health, poor labor market records to earn an income that would actually make it worthwhile to move into employment. So making work pay is a critical issue for Denmark. I have only 1.5 minutes left, but I also have only one slide left, fortunately. So in terms of the big conclusions in our work, it's very clear that mental ill health creates significant labor market disadvantage and creates a lot of costs for the individual, but in particular costs for employers and also costs for society as a whole. I think the Danish system is in a good starting position in principle, if only we would be able to make sure that the setup delivers. So we have to work more on making it work rather than changing the system altogether. And among the problems are that systems are under-resourced to actually deal with mental health and lack the competence to identify issues, problems, and address them. And I think the improvements will lie, therefore, in 3 fields. First, to make the reforms of the past work for this group of clients. Second, to tailor services and approaches to this big group, which is the biggest group in all the systems. And third, and most importantly, what we really need is integrated services. Integration of health and employment services. What is really critical is that health and employment needs of these people are being tackled at the same time. And that is very much in line with what Paul Nyrup Rasmussen said in the very beginning. We cannot just wait until people are cured and then start thinking about integrating them back in the labor market. In particular, because mental illness generally is not properly cured. It's about managing to live with it and work with it. And employment would really, as he said, be the best way to integrate. Thank you.